All right, I haven't really prepared anything for this, but what I'm really going to do is just sort of prefigure a slightly bigger talk that I'm planning for the Remembering Aquarius a little bit later in the month, which is to really sort of have a look, I suppose, at the Northern Rivers and over the last 40 years about this sort of the issue of activism and how that's really grown and what kind of contribution the Northern Rivers has been able to make both you know, environmentally, socially, but probably even more so, you know, looking at it nationally and internationally. So, you know, and it's certainly my aim to sort of look back to some extent, but to look back with a view of getting us back in the present and saying, well, you know, where are we heading, and, you know, what have we got to be proud of, and how can we continue to export this to the world? So, you know, no doubt you've sort of heard plenty about the festival itself. Myself, I'm just a youngster. I was too young to go to the Aquarius Festival. When was it? I think I was in late primary school at the time, so I'm not going to provide a photograph of myself for the biographies. Yeah, what I've been particularly interested in, of course, is the activism, and I suppose in many ways, you know, we sort of start that story often. I mean, it's certainly not the story of the start of activism in Australia. We can go back through trade unions, we can go back through all sorts of things, but certainly the style of definitely non-violent direct action activism in the way that we've seen it certainly got a good, you know, starting place in Terrania. Again, not entirely only there. I mean, there was, you know, the Daintree and you know, Franklin River, of course, are other sort of famous sites. But the 70s was certainly an early place to be starting with the Terrania and Nightcap campaigns and really forging sort of a new sort of and much more bold approach to activism, and one in which sort of certainly getting arrested and being, not just getting arrested, but being quite sort of militant in the way you sort of penetrate behind the lines and stuff things up. Certainly came along, and certainly to my knowledge what came out of that as well is the nomadic action groups who, you know, not content to just have it in the backyard, in the hills behind Nimbin, sort of took that on the road, which is, you know, part of the reason why some of those campaigns and campaign methodologies moved forward to the Franklin and to Daintree in its turn. And certainly, you know, I never really measure the success of campaigns by whether the police came and busted the people out or whether the people won at the time, because if you really look back over most of these campaigns, whether we get busted out or whether we don't, we make enormous progress. You know, we might have got busted out of the Daintree, but the World Heritage Area of the Wet Tropics was eventually declared. We were getting busted out of the Franklin, but the federal election occurred. And certainly that sort of awareness of understanding the impact we have whether we get busted out or not is, I think, a big part of the maturation of us as a social movement as well. Interestingly, you know, it didn't just start there and emerge later. I think one of the really big, you know, universities really of activism was the forest campaigns of the late 1980s and particularly the 1990s. I've sort of written about this in an article, and certainly what I saw with the, particularly the work of the North East Forest Alliance coming out of this area, and not just this area, but actually linking with other communities right up the New South Wales coast from sort of just north of Sydney out to the tablelands and all the way up, was a really, really powerful and large social movement that was very much, you know, capable of taking on, you know, a landscape-wide campaign all the way from Sydney to the Queensland border. So it was sort of like, you know, Terrania and Nightcap sort of multiplied by 20 or something to really take on the whole movement. The NEFA campaigns were highly successful at both a sort of a legal professional activist angle as well as at the non-violent direct action angle, and certainly you know, we're able to sort of develop those methodologies and export those methodologies to other groups. And indeed, even at that time, NEFA activists were often down in Victoria sort of providing training to other groups as well. You know, some of the things that we really gained out of that, I think, and it's always good to look at that to say, you know, there's the campaign, there's the blockades, there's the politics, and we can sort of assess all that stuff. But what we also need to assess is the social movements and the effect of those social movements over time, how they enrich our culture and how they build towards something bigger as they go along. And I certainly looked at the North East Forest Alliance experience as not just an enormously successful one. I mean, they blockaded for over 10 years, did it on a landscape-wide scale, basically ran a wide-ranging guerrilla war, a non-violent guerrilla war against the New South Wales government, Amongst their highlights, of course, was the actual scalping of the former Premier Nick Greiner, who was forced from office because of corrupt deals he was making to try and overcome the gains that were being made by the Old Growth Forest campaign movement. Towards the end of that campaign, there was a political solution in the forests in which the high conservation value in old growth forests that NEFA had sort of drawn on a map in around 1989 and 1990 were actually being transferred into a very large reserve system, certainly by the early 2000s. Of course, that wasn't the end of the battle, and it's never the end of any of these battles. For a start, the battle moved on to regrowth forests and private land logging after that. And now, with our new ultra-conservative New South Wales government, we're hoping they don't extend from shooting in national parks to logging in national parks and mining in national parks. And certainly that's something that many of them would wish to do. So it's very important, I think, to focus on the methodologies and the social movements that we develop through our activism, because we're going to need them again. It's not a case of just a win-lose scenario where we might win these battles and we can tick them off and sort of go back to sleep. It's a case that we really need to develop ourselves as living communities of resistance. And I think that's one of the things that inspires me most about the Northern Rivers and about the whole experience over the last 4 or more decades, is that sense of us as a living community of resistance. So where Terania and Nightcap might have been localised, where NEFA might have taken that to a broad scale and run the whole of the northeastern part of New South Wales and won a very difficult and large forest campaign, the thing that is really amazing now is to look at the campaign against coal seam gas. Absolutely fascinates me. Not just because it's a political campaign, not just because it's an environmental threat, not just because we're blockading and winning, but because of the development, the ongoing development of the Northern Rivers as a really, really powerful community of resistance, and how we are not only asserting that, developing it, but actually even exporting it to the world. I was driving out towards Tenterfield just the other day, and on my own in the car, just looking out at, you'd go over the hill there at the range and you'd look out over the Northern Rivers, and just realising that even my own personal sense of it had changed in the last year because of the coal seam gas campaigns. Instead of driving out and thinking, oh yeah, there's the ranges near Toonambar where I frequent or live, and yeah, that's great, that's territory I feel like is home. I looked across the whole Northern Rivers and felt this enormous sense of kind of, not ownership, but an enormous sense of belonging and connectedness, where I just thought, this is the Northern Rivers, fuck off, don't fuck with us, you're not mining here. We've claimed it, we've won it, and you're not coming back, and I'm sure, so many of us feel that. And so it's, this incredible, and I think, that's what is really sort of inspiring me about the social movements that we're engaged in, is not just the campaigns, not just the winning and losing, but building that resistance and that sustainability as a community of resistance. And I think that's one of the most amazing things going forward that we're getting out of the coal seam gas campaign, is not just the political side of it, the way we've built that community. And I think I'm sort of seeing it getting bigger and bigger. Localised campaigns, but in a sense, with Terania and the Nightcap, we were identified as a marginalised social movement. With NEFA, we took on a very big slice of the state and won it, and we knocked down a premier, took over the Forestry Commission building, did all sorts of amazing things, achieved a huge reserve system. I mean, the ultimate achievement of NEFA was something like 160 hectares in reserve for every day that they'd been blockading, which in itself was astounding. But still, doing that as a fairly marginalised movement. I think the really big thing we've achieved with the coal seam gas campaign is we are that community of resistance, but it's now not just the whole of the Northern Rivers, it's the whole of the society of the Northern Rivers. We've been achieving these figures like 87% support, 95% support. We've been standing on the blockades with the farmers and with the Gidabal and the other Indigenous people, and really, weaving a fabric, sorry about the phone ringing, it does that about every 30 seconds, 12 hours a day. Just weaving this fabric that's going to take us forward. So whether, wherever we go with the politics of those campaigns, that fabric keeps building, and that fabric's very, very important. So I think, we need to put a lot of store and a lot of, congratulate ourselves, but feel, the strength, but really, understand the importance of continuing to build those community links. I think we can't underestimate at all how powerful it is to have finally stepped across that threshold from being marginalised social movements to being a mainstream social movement. That is something that is incredible. It's scaring the hell out of our political opponents, and it's something that I hope we keep building on. The other thing that I think is amazing, not only that it's stretched across all the different social groups, but that it's also recombined the Northern Rivers. You know, we always thought of the Northern Rivers as a region, but I think since the coal seam gas campaign, we feel the Northern Rivers as a region. You know, Grafton is part of us, Casino is part of us. It's no longer just sitting in our silos at Byron or Nimbin or wherever. You know, we really feel we're together. So, you know, they're the things I think we need to really focus on. That it's the cultural development that lives behind those political processes where we really build ourselves as communities of resistance, because we're going to need that for the future, whether it's coal seam gas, whether it's shooting in national parks, whether it's old growth logging, whether it's gold mining at Timburra, whether it's Club Med at Byron. It's going to keep happening. It's our power as communities that's going to carry us through into the future.